is Laura from Happy Horse Healthy Planet. Thanks for joining me. Last week I was in Richmond, Virginia presenting a PowerPoint to a really nifty group of horseback riders. They have a club and get together once a month and have different speakers. I was talking to them about how to keep their horses cool in this hot, humid Virginia weather. On the way home I thought, why don't I turn that into a video and share it with my bloggers? So I hope you enjoy it, and please drop me a note and let me know any tips you might have that keep your horse cool. Thanks. Happy riding.
Hello everyone, and welcome to how to keep your horse cool in hot weather. I hope to offer you some strategies on how to prevent heat stress in your horse and some things to do in case it happens. Horses are susceptible to three very serious conditions when it is hot and humid outside. The first is dehydration, the second is heat exhaustion, and then that can escalate to full-blown heat stroke. All of them are very similar in the way you prevent them or treat them, but the effects on the horse are progressive.
But first, a few facts. I was amazed to realize that it only takes 17 minutes of moderate intensity exercise in some hot and humid weather to raise a horse's temperature to what's considered dangerous, which is greater than 103 degrees Fahrenheit. I was also amazed to find that cross-country phase of a three-phase event can produce enough heat in the horse to raise its body temperature more than 15 degrees. So your horse with a 100-degree average temperature can go to 115 degrees just during the cross-country phase. The cooling principle in a horse is basically very similar to humans. They produce sweat when their body temperature rises, it evaporates, and then it lowers the body temperature. About 65% of a horse's cooling comes from this sweat evaporation. It's kind of interesting to note that horses are the only other mammal besides humans that cool themselves in this manner. So a horse in a hard-working environment, hot, humid days, can lose 2 to 4 gallons of sweat per hour. So think of that gallon milk jug. That's a lot of sweat. And so it's really important during this kind of exercise and sweating that sufficient quantities of water are supplied back to the horse so it can be converted into perspiration. But horses don't just lose water. They also lose electrolytes, which are like the salts in the sweat. If you lick your lip when you're sweating and it tastes salty, those are electrolytes. In horses, the important electrolytes they lose are sodium, magnesium, calcium, potassium, and chloride. And these electrolytes need to be in balance in order to trigger the thirst response and have muscle function and everything else balanced within your horse. There is a condition called anhidrosis where horses cannot sweat at all. They used to think it was just heat related, but now they've discovered that it actually is genetic in some horses. So they can be perfectly fine in normal weather, but the stress of the heat and humidity causes this genetically geared horse to have this condition. Other horses just suffer from this condition when they're in heat exhaustion or heat stroke. And what they discovered is that there's this overstimulation of the sweat glands by epinephrine, which is a stress hormone, and it causes the sweat glands to just completely shut down. So a good way to assess your risk before you set out and make plans to go ride is the heat index, which basically takes the current temperature, you add in the humidity factor, you subtract the wind, and then you look at that number. The day that I looked at, there was 93 degrees out, there was 44% humidity, which equals 137. There was literally no wind. So at 137, we were all right. We were fine to work. If that number gets around 150, let's say the humidity was about 60%, you need to address that and account for that in your riding. If it exceeds 180, you really probably should refrain from hauling or exercising your horse on that day. The first level of heat stress is called dehydration. And basically it's simply the loss of body water through sweat and the waste products of feces and urine. Horses have a significant amount of muscle mass, so because of that, they can generate a huge amount of muscle heat, which then generates a lot of sweat. So horses are more susceptible to dehydration than most any other animal. The first sign of dehydration is that the skin will lose pliability, meaning that it doesn't bounce back. If you pinch it along the neck, it actually just stays there. Another sign is mucous membrane refill and color. Sometimes they'll turn blue instead of pink. Their refill time is very delayed. If you press a finger to the gum, it should refill within 1 to 3 seconds. So anything longer than that is cause for concern. Obviously, an elevated temperature is going to indicate heat stress, as the average horse temperature, internal temperature rectally, is between 99 and 100. So anything over 103 could indicate some heat stress in your horse. Pulse increases, and the normal resting heart rate of 30 to 40 beats per minute gets doubled to 80 or more beats per minute in heat stress and dehydration. You can take a horse's pulse by placing your fingers right by the jaw, midway between the jaw and the front teeth, or by right behind the foreleg. You want to look at that pulse and count it for 15 seconds and then multiply that by 4. Because we're talking about pulse and the next slide is about respiration, I'm going to mention thumps here. And that is a term that refers to when the diaphragm and the heartbeat, they are at the same rhythm. So the horse's flanks are actually synchronized with the horse's pulse. Another sign of dehydration in your horse and heat stress is an increase in respiration. You can see the respiration and count those in and out breaths by looking at their nostrils, maybe even holding your hand in front of them, or by watching at the end of their rib cage it go in and out. As with the heart rate, you want to count for 15 seconds and then multiply by 4. The normal adult horse at rest has about, 8 to 20. It kind of varies there, breaths per minute, but in heat stress, it's anything greater than 40. So what happens if you come home from work or you're on a trail ride and you notice your horse is showing some signs of dehydration? You want to move them into the shade first and foremost, because that will lower their internal temperature because breathing that cooler air. If there's a fan around, you can stick them in front of the fan. That will help with evaporation, and also cool them down with some cold water. Continuous hosing around the neck and where the blood vessels are closer to the surface is really helpful. And you want to offer them water. Some people get a little concerned about offering a horse hot water. But if you think about it, the biggest concern is getting too much in their stomach. But they can hold 2 to 4 gallons without becoming distended. So if you only offer them a quarter of your 5-gallon bucket every few minutes or so, you should be safe. In milder cases of dehydration, you can give them some oral electrolytes in their feed or in their drinking water, or even in an oral paste. But if you have multiple of these signs of dehydration, your vet should have been called, and they can actually test the blood and see what electrolytes might be missing. If you don't address the dehydration, it can go to heat exhaustion with blinding speed. In heat exhaustion, the amount of sweat increases, and with that, the imbalance of body fluids and electrolytes increases as well. I thought this was fascinating that a horse's body temperature, when it gets to 105 or 106 degrees, can mean that his muscles are as high as 109. And at that point, the proteins, amino acids in his muscles will start to cook and break down. Heat exhaustion symptoms are just like, you have all the same ones as dehydration, but they are intensified. The body temperature is now at 106. Those mucous membranes are not only slow to refill, but they are dry. You usually will have some thumps in these horses. That's that respiration and pulse rate. You will have some horses that become very dull and listless. You'll have other horses that become agitated and restless. Sometimes they'll drop themselves down to the ground. Their flanks can get drawn up, and because at this temperature those proteins in the muscles are starting to cook, you'll have some muscle quivering and possibly tying up.
You have to treat this very aggressively. Your vet should have been called by now. You need to become very diligent by pouring water over him in the bucket, sponging around their heads and face, spraying with a hose as much as you can. If there's a stream or pond on your farm, maybe even walk them into that and immerse them in the water, leaving that top back big muscles free so they can evaporate the heat. You don't really want to apply ice water directly to those large gluteal muscles on the back. You want that heat to be able to evaporate, but focus rather on the neck areas where those blood vessels are closer to the surface. And when your vet gets there, they will probably start the horse on some IV fluids with electrolytes. If this horse was at higher risk and considered in heat exhaustion, something would have needed to be done immediately, because if left untreated, it can go right into a heat stroke. And at that point, the cooling mechanism of the horse totally fails. Basically, he can't counteract his overheated body. If immediate help is not right on place at that time, they will probably die.
At this point, anhidrosis is very prevalent in all these horses. They can't sweat anymore because their cooling mechanism is shut down. Their temperatures are between 106 and 110 degrees. And at that point, you'll see some central nervous system dysfunction. They usually fall down, they weave, they're not aware of their surroundings, so you need to really be careful. If they are treated and survive, they can also have laminitis and kidney and liver failure as a result. Heat stroke obviously needs to be addressed by a veterinarian, but in the meantime, you can put really cold water, ice packs on their head to try to offset some of the neurological impact. And I thought this was kind of interesting. If the horse cools down before the vet arrives, you want to rub them with towels. You don't want them to get chilled because that could add shock onto it. So in order to provide and prevent your horse from getting these things, there are a few tips you can do around the barn. The first and foremost is providing cool water so that horse can replenish any kind of moisture he's lost. You want to make sure that the water stays clean. And this was a barn call I just went on the other day. She had been at work all day. She had actually given her horse a large muck bucket, clean of course, full of water. And when she got home, he had already gone to the bathroom in it and obviously hadn't drank. We don't know how long it had been, but that's a cause for concern. You need to choose cooler turnout times and possibly turn them out at night if you can. Providing shade will again allow them to breathe cooler air. You can even get solar operated fans for the run-in shed. Misting your horse is a great way to provide a continuous form, and you can even attach some misting hoses to the beams in a run-in shed or along the fence line, or you can even create your own misting fans. Moving the air is a great way. Fans right directly on their stalls not only provide a cooling breeze, but help with the flies. Just make sure you keep the cords out of reach. But if you're planning a new building or retrofitting, you might want to add these fans, overhead fans. This is an example of what's called big ass fans, and they're an awesome addition to a barn. Providing your horse with salt will trigger that thirst response, just like when you eat potato chips. So that'll cause him to drink a little bit more. And adding electrolytes into their water can also help keep his body balanced. One of the things I want to mention here, though, is you don't want to add electrolytes the day of the show or the trail ride event. You want to get them used to drinking electrolytes. The heavy sweating at a competitive you would want to administer those electrolytes 1 to 2 days before the competition, throughout the competition, and then after. Usually you're going to do 1 to 4 ounces depending on the sweat loss and the heat and humidity levels. But it's about 30 to 90 grams per hour of strenuous work. But just look at the manufacturer's instructions and that'll help you know how much to give. You can always add a couple of pasture braids if your horse has a long mane. You can even ride them in these so that it'll help the heat come off of their neck. Fly sprays that are sweat proof can also allow the sweat to build up, so make sure that you bathe the horse occasionally to get that buildup off. And then horses with metabolic issues like Cushing's or insulin resistance, they tend to hold on to their long hair coats, so you're going to want to clip those. During the ride, you always want to slow the work down during hot, humid days, using short sessions where you stop, offer water, take some breaks. If you can, you want to ride during the cooler times of day, and maybe even wipe their head and face off with a sponge during your rides. After the ride, you always want to walk your horse to cool them down, because moving will help the muscles dissipate the heat better than if they're just resting. Maybe even walk them in a shady spot. You always want to wash them down with cool water and scrape as you go. You might have noticed in the previous video at Rolex, they hosed and wiped and then scraped, because you don't want the hair to absorb the water and then prevent the evaporation of the heat. During the shows or competitions, you want to let your horse drink after a workout or after the class. You should really always bring your own water, either in one of these 5-gallon lidded buckets or in this H2O to go bag. That way you can assure that they're going to drink at the show. I always bring their bucket from their stall as well. You'd also want to watch using too much show sheen, because that can also build up and trap the heat. You always want to remember to pack your sponge and bucket so you can wipe them down in between classes. And then here's a little recipe for an ice pack that you can freeze. It never gets too hard like regular ice, so you can actually lay it across their neck or behind their ears to cool them down. I use these snack size little sandwich bags and make myself one. I wrap it in a bandana and put it behind my neck. If you're out on the trails, go ahead and let them drink when you come to some water. Maybe even let them stand in it. Or pack a sponge and hang it from your saddle, so when you reach the water, you can sponge them off. If you allow your horse to eat along the trail, that'll encourage the thirst and obviously drinking. If you have to trailer in hot, humid weather, you always want to trailer at night or in the morning hours. If you are trailering in 90-degree or more weather, you always want to stop frequently and provide water. Obviously, use the best ventilated trailer you can. And if you use rubber mats and shavings or straw, it'll help the heat from the road. It'll help insulate the horse and the trailer from the heat from the road. So as you can see, getting your horse to drink is the most important message. I don't care how he finds the water, even if he has to bob for apples in a kiddie pool. Even if you share your own, you really want to make sure you get that water back in your horse. Thanks for listening, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or additional tips. Please follow me on all social media and help keep your horses happy and healthy.